Welcome to CancerTalks, a podcast sharing stories of personal transformation and collective healing from people who have been touched by cancer. My name is Claire, and I'll be guiding today's conversation. If you're listening on an iPhone, click the plus sign in the upper right corner to follow our show and get notified when a new episode is released. My guest today is Polly Hoppin. I invited Polly to have a conversation with me to highlight the power and the potential of focusing on cancer prevention in addition to treatment. Polly co-founded the National Cancer-Free Economy Network. The network shares our vision for a world where no one gets sick from toxic chemicals polluting the places they live, learn, work, and play. CancerTalks just became an ally member of the network, and we're excited to be part of their amazing work. Polly is also director of the Cancer and Environment Initiative at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell, and senior advisor to the Cancer and Environment Network of Southwestern Pennsylvania. Polly received her Doctor of Science degree from Johns Hopkins University, in the course of which cancer arrived at her family's doorstep. An experience which, along with her own cancer journey more recently, enriched her life and work. Hi, Polly. Welcome to Cancer Talks.
Thank you, Claire. I'm so glad to be here. I can't remember how you discovered that I might be somebody you might want to talk to, but however it was, I'm grateful. This is going to be great to talk about these things together.
Well, that's maybe kind of a nice place to start. I was researching cancer prevention because, as you know, and as you work on, a lot of the biggest cancer organizations are not prevention focused. And that means that also we haven't had that many guests who are talking explicitly about prevention on the podcast. So it's something that's very close to my heart, not for a personal reason, but just because I really believe in preventative medicine. And yeah, so I was just poking around, and I'm so glad I found you.
That's great. I'm glad you are too. How did you come to that sort of orientation, do you think?
Oh, that's such a good question. I actually think it was through a sort of minor health journey in my life, dealing with skin issues and being told that I wasn't allergic to anything for a very long time. But I had terrible eczema and hives that would recur. And sometimes I would think I had poison oak, but it actually wasn't poison oak. And it was just really kind of embarrassing as a kid and uncomfortable. And yeah, all the allergists that my parents found said I wasn't allergic to anything. And they would give me cortisone, and then the cortisone would thin my skin. And it was so scary and frustrating to be told, to be given these what were supposed to be cures and see nothing change. And then through my own process of elimination, I realized it was a nightshade allergy.
Wow.
And then started to eliminate nightshades. And then I was like, it was just gone. And it was so crazy to discover that for myself and see that finding the source of the issue meant that I just didn't even need a doctor and didn't need medicine.
Wow.
So yeah, that was my personal way into it. And I started, when I started working with the podcast, started seeing parallels there with cancer, which is a much more, life-threatening, life-shattering experience than a skin condition, but a lot of parallels.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I wanted to start by hearing a little bit about who you were before cancer came into your life. Now it's such a big part of your life.
Yeah. Well, let's see. As a kid, I also moved to many places before I was 6 years old, 4 different places. And then when I was 6, we landed in Boston. My dad was a medical doctor and also a public health person, and that theme will probably circle back in our conversation. My mom was a teacher, so there was just a lot of people in our lives, a lot of people who my dad worked with internationally that would come and stay with us for periods of time, a lot of students and fellow faculty members and others that were in and out of my family's house. So it was an environment that was really rich in terms of being exposed to a lot of different kinds of people, different lived experiences that people had. There's a lot of gardening, especially my mom, who just loved to garden and then cooked from the garden.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of, family activity around that. And I was, a normal kid growing up in a neighborhood that was very tight. We had a lot of, running back and forth between our houses and a lot of shared things among neighbors, but we were also in the middle of the city. So it was a wonderful place to grow up. I had a really strong voice as a kid, and a story that my mom tells was that I was 3 and I was having a temper tantrum that was so violent that I actually fainted.
Oh my God.
And my poor mom, who at that point was, I think, 23 years old, picked up this 3-year-old child who appeared to be unconscious and went running down the street to her neighbor's house to try to get some help. And that was a stage of my life where this incredible sort of emotional intensity that I had was just showing up the way it would in a 3-year-old. And as a kid, I needed to learn how to channel that. But it was a theme that has sort of stuck through of having a powerful voice and wanting to learn how to channel it in ways that were directed to things that felt important. So that I think led to activism fairly early in my life. And certainly as a high schooler, that's what I did in college, was various kinds of campaigns related to environmental stuff, for sure, and also economic issues and other things.
Do you remember what some of those early campaigns were?
Yeah, they were around toxic waste issues.
Wow.
So there was a issue of a number of communities around the country, like Love Canal, you may remember that one, a number of them that were discovering people's health being badly impacted by old industrial waste sites or the dumping of pesticides or that kind of thing. And so these communities were starting to recognize this, and there really were no federal resources available at the time for addressing these kinds of issues for people and helping them. So I was part of a movement which became really large over the next number of years and resulted in the federal Superfund program that was established in order to clean up these places. So that was really a transformative experience for me, was working in communities where people were having these unbelievable health experiences and really getting doors slammed in their face in terms of any acknowledgement that this might be something that was connected to the water that they were drinking or the air that they were breathing.
What year was that?
This was in the late 70s, early 80s. Yeah.
And were any of these communities you were initially working with close to home?
They were. There were probably at that point maybe 8 or 10 designated communities that ultimately became Superfund sites that were, within a drive of where I lived, not right in my backyard, but, towns that I had known from growing up. And one of them in particular had a couple of friends that I knew well from school who lived there.
Wow.
And so I would go over and have play dates with them. And at the time, didn't realize that those were places where ultimately, these waste sites would be discovered and these health hazards identified. But they were familiar places to me when I got to that stage.
Yeah. And then did you jump into a career that has something to do with what you're doing now? Or what was your first sort of career path?
Yeah, I did. That work that I was talking about around toxic waste issues was something that I did in high school. And then after college, I returned to that. So started out working for Clean Water Action, which is a national network of organizations working on water, which still exists. And that was a time when this organizing I was describing and having really turning into a movement had really hit a peak. And so I worked with them for 4 years, and both in Washington, D.C., and then also back in Massachusetts. And my work really was to do both advocacy for policies that could change the use of toxic chemicals over time, and really groundbreaking law in Massachusetts that was passed called the Toxic Use Reduction Act, which was designed to help companies reduce their own use of toxic chemicals so that over time things would become safer. And then on the other hand, this direct community work to support people who were confronting health problems. And what then led me to graduate school, which was my next step, which was 4 years after that, was at the time the sense that access to science and scientific expertise to help people understand what was really going on in their community was just, there just were not very many so-called public interest scientists. And at the time, in the early 80s, the EPA was really not a friend to these communities. It was under the Reagan administration, and it was run by a woman who really was all about dismantling the EPA. And so there were a lot of scientific resources that EPA would otherwise have brought to the community that were not available to them. And then there were industry scientists that were, working for industry. So that really led me to go back to graduate school and to set about learning enough of the science that I could then use that as I came out of graduate school to support organizations and people that were being directly impacted by these things. So
you became a scientist.
I have a doctorate of science,
Wow.
but I really work at the intersection of science and policy. So there are thousands of people that are much more highly trained on the science side, but I know enough about it to engage with it and help shape and direct research, sort of help try to understand what the questions are that people need answers to, and how research might be designed to get those questions answered, and how they might be able to participate in the design of that research, but then also to understand the science well enough to be able to advocate for policy and other kinds of solutions to address the problems that the research is identifying. So it's kind of at that intersection between science and then, what do we do with it?
Yeah. And so when did cancer in particular come into your work?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And how would I answer that? So shortly after graduate school, I was working at an environmental organization. And one of the things that was being developed there was this understanding of the impact of toxic chemicals on wildlife. And there was an extraordinary woman there called Theo Colborn, who a lot of people refer to now as like the next generation's Rachel Carson, although she's since passed away. But she was a pharmacologist and zoologist, and she was seeing in the wildlife literature a lot of indication that chemicals were having impacts on wildlife that were odd, just strange impacts, and things like eggshell thinning from DDT, that kind of stuff had been seen over a number of years, but these were starting to show up with sort of androgynous sexual impacts for wildlife, lots of things like that. And she began looking in multiple different literatures, so epidemiology literature, zoology literature, and she started seeing patterns in all of these different fields. So she reached out to some of the researchers in those different fields, and she put together a 3-day meeting that brought together people who didn't know about each other's work, and basically they all presented a paper to each other, and she was seeing these patterns. But what happened in the meeting is that these scientists started to see these patterns that they thought might be only within their field, but then they were seeing it in other fields, and the light bulbs just started going off to say, something's happening here that we didn't understand before. And that was basically the birth of the field of endocrine disrupting chemicals that basically disrupt the normal functioning of hormones in the body. And so it was a really interesting time to be at World Wildlife Fund where this work was taking place. And one of the implications of disruption of the endocrine system is that it can help set the body up for the development of cancer later on. So that was the first time that, concretely I began really thinking about the connection between environment and cancer in my work, other than having seen in these communities that I was talking about elevated rates of cancer among kids and others.
I didn't know that origin story about the endocrine science, because it's now a pretty broadly understood aspect of cancer.
It is, exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So that, and then just about that time is actually in, I don't remember the year, but I was actually literally in the waiting room while my husband was getting his first cancer surgery, reading the final draft, or, one before final draft of a book that Theo Colborn had co-written with two other people called Our Stolen Future. And it was a book about endocrine disruption and what was being learned. And it had a chapter on testicular cancer, which was the kind of cancer that my husband had.
Wow.
And the book chapter was about this being one of the kinds of cancers that is going up in incidence. So more and more new cases being diagnosed, and which has a strong scientific basis of being connected to environmental exposures in some way. So there I was, literally in the reading room, with a work assignment while I was waiting for him to get his first surgery. And so that brought it all together, brought, a personal experience together with a work experience. And it was heady. Sometimes it was just too much for all that to be landing at the same time.
Yeah. Can we backtrack a little bit? Because you're doing this work and your husband receives a cancer diagnosis. Can you just share the story of the moment you found out?
Yeah, sure. He had, unbeknownst to me, felt a lump, and we were away on vacation in the summer. We were in Maine. And so he didn't go, as immediately to his doctor as he probably otherwise would have, but, fairly soon. And so it was in the fall, and I was just pregnant with our second child when he got his first diagnosis. And he had his first surgery called an orchiectomy, and they removed the tumor, but they said that it had gotten out of the original site a little bit. And that was my first experience, and my own cancer experience was similar in the sense that it was like, oh boy, if we had come in a couple of weeks earlier, it might not have gotten out of the original tumor site. But things looked pretty good, but they said because it had gotten out that they recommended a very major surgery called a retroperitoneal lymph node dissection. So that was to remove all the landing sites, all the lymph nodes where metastasis might be likely to occur. So that happened a month and a half later, and then it was really just sort of wait and see. And in February, our daughter was born, and he missed his monthly appointment where they're checking, tumor markers and doing a CT scan. But we never got a call from them saying, "Where are you? You missed it." And so by the time he went in for his monthly appointment in March, it was metastasized into his lungs. And it turns out there was a pretty significant medical error where in the January appointment, 2 months before that, there had been signs of potential metastasis on the CAT scan, and we were not told about that. So there was a delay in a couple different phases, which led to an additional round of chemo beyond what would have originally taken place. And anyway, long story short, he's fine. And testicular cancer is one of those cancers where I mentioned the rates are going up. So more and more people getting it, but also more and more people being cured. And I think that's a common reality for certain kinds of cancers now. And childhood cancer is another one where the rates of childhood cancer are going up, and many more kids are getting cured. And it's really good news that more and more people are getting cured. And if my husband had gotten the same kind of cancer a couple decades before he did, he probably wouldn't have lived. I mean, it's gone from a cancer with a survival rate of, very, very few to a really high survival rate. But at the same time, with more and more people getting it, the question is, well, why? What's going on that might be causing this? And also, our ultimate goal can't be to have more and more people getting cancer and then, surviving it. Because as we know, surviving it is not a picnic either. There's a lot that comes with having been through that journey, whether it be physical or emotional or financial or other. So it was really a 2-year process overall from the time he was diagnosed to he had a total of 7 surgeries and multiple rounds of chemo. And
oh my God.
I had, our daughters were 5 and 0, basically 0 to 2 during that time. So it was an intense time for us. And
were you still working?
I was.
Wow.
Yeah. I was working 3 days a week for a period of time there. And so back and forth a little bit. And the work folks were incredibly supportive and we had just a village of neighbors and family and others that were just helping out in so many different ways, that it was one of those experiences of, would never wish it on anybody. And coming out the other side of it, there was an element of just support and love and connection. And that was something, that's lasted with both of us for ever since. And that we're really grateful for. And that wouldn't have happened, but for the cancer experience that he had.
How did that experience just affect the way that you related to cancer? From what I know you do now, it sounds like it had a huge impact on how you think about cancer.
Yeah, it absolutely did. And, it's kind of a both and, because he would not be around but for incredibly sophisticated cancer treatment and all the resources that have gone into developing those treatments. So I'm incredibly grateful for all of that. And this sense that we've got to figure out a way to begin to reverse these upward trends. And cancer overall, is doing better. And that's largely thanks to tobacco cessation. And there are so many tobacco-related illnesses that the overall rates are, have begun to plateau. But with testicular, with other, breast cancer, others, childhood cancer, these rates are continuing to go up. So it really was an experience of both and for me. And that's what I've continued to work with is, not to emphasize the issue of environment exclusively over the issues of treatment, but to especially encourage cancer-focused organizations, cancer research institutions, cancer advocacy groups, cancer support organizations to add to their agendas the issue of prevention in general, and also in particular, the issue of environmental chemicals. Yeah, so that is what I've been doing for the last 7 or 8 years, very specifically, is developing networks of organizations that work on the environmental contributors to cancer and can, engage in all the aspects of cancer prevention, which are some individual things that individuals can do, but also in these larger issues of how do you pass policies that can help reduce carcinogens and promote safer alternatives. So yeah, it was very influential. The specific cancer-focused work in particular for me came not immediately on the heels of that, but it was absolutely formative.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you feel prepared to give a little overview of the current science, like a little taste of what we know about links between environmental toxicity and cancer?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So in one of the projects that I'm involved in, we track the journals that publish on these issues and how many publications there are every month around cancer and environment. And there's, anywhere from 25 to 30 studies in really well-regarded journals on these connections. And, some of them are epidemiology. We're actually seeing cancers in populations that are directly tied to exposures that those populations have had. And one area where there's a lot of strong science is in workplaces, where people have been exposed to chemicals and they've shown up with certain kinds of cancers, or 9/11 first responders, situations where there's very good data on what people were exposed to and then the subsequent cancers that developed. So there's the epidemiology is, always growing in that area. And then there's also animal studies, which, look at the different kinds of things that occur in rodents, especially as a result of being exposed. And those turn out to be, really good models for human beings. And there's a couple of organizations, but the best known and really reputable is called the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is a World Health Organization entity. And it takes up, the task of looking at different chemicals exhaustively and comprehensively, looking at all of the literature and pulling together expert teams of people who review all of that and then come to consensus around what kind of classification a chemical might be in with regard to cancer. So and that has, classifications of this chemical is known to cause cancer, or this chemical probably causes cancer. So there's a couple different classifications. But for example, they've in the last 5 years determined that air pollution causes lung cancer and is implicated in a number of other kinds of cancers like bladder cancer.
So this is now scientifically recorded.
Absolutely, yeah. By global, very well respected scientific organizations determining this. Yeah. Formaldehyde, which you've probably heard a lot about in particle board, used in a whole variety of things. A byproduct that's created sometimes from different chemicals that's in shampoo. Formaldehyde is a known carcinogen. Perchloroethylene, which is the sweet smelling chemical that when you go into a dry cleaner, there's that particular smell. That's perchloroethylene. That's a known carcinogen. And that was one of the sort of scientific studies, many of them that are implicating perchloroethylene have come from military exposures, because that's a solvent that's used on military bases and it's gotten into drinking water. So Camp Lejeune, for example, in North Carolina, where there's a number of veterans males who have breast cancer and a number of other kinds of cancers that have been attributed to perchloroethylene.
Those two chemicals are legal still right now in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's a couple hundred that are on that list, and they're ones to which we're all widely exposed. PFAS is another category of chemicals that you've probably heard of, these perfluoro, whole class of thousands, but the class is called PFAS. And those are showing up in drinking water really everywhere. And the science is not quite as strong yet, but there are a number of studies that are suggesting that PFAS is contributing to cancers as well. And these are almost never the only cause of cancer. And, this distinction between an individual knowing what kind of cancer or what might have caused their cancer is different from being able to say, well, at a population level, although we can't say that that particular child's cancer was caused by air pollution, we can say that at a population level, we know that some children's cancers, leukemias, were caused by air pollution. So that's always hard for people to kind of grasp is, it's very rarely in an occupational case, you can often say, yeah, your cancer was caused by this occupational exposure, because it's so clear that you did have that exposure, but it's much harder to, if you're just in the sort of general public. But since you can see those things at a population level, then you can figure out things that can be done to reduce those exposures at a population level. Yeah. So, but in any individual's case, it might have had a contributor of an environmental exposure, and then there's other aspects of your own biology and many other risk factors for cancer, and then there's some genetic components to some. So it's a disease that develops as a result of multiple factors, and these are some of them.
So you work with the Cancer-Free Economy Network. Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
For listeners, what is the cancer-free economy?
Yeah, good question. So the cancer-free economy is a economy that produces things that we need, products that we all use, airplanes, cars, couches, and jobs, that does not depend on things that cause cancer, and that does not depend on cancer. And so there's a little bit of a reference in that term to the idea that there's a lot of money that gets made in cancer. There's a
even in curing cancer.
Exactly. And that's as it is within the context of the kind of economic system that we have, but it's sort of a feedback loop which drives towards more of a treatment orientation than towards a prevention orientation, because prevention doesn't pay in the same way.
You actually just answered the question my question was phrased as, why do you think so many cancer nonprofits focus on research toward a cure as opposed to prevention?
Yeah, I think it I think that, and this is another insight that I've just had, having cancer myself and also my husband, is just we love each other and we love our kids, we love our parents, we love our neighbors, and we love our broader community. Sometimes doesn't feel like that all the time in the current political climate, but fundamentally, human beings are loving beings. And so if someone is sick, we're going to pull out all the stops. And I feel that that's a very real motivation for people who are in the business of cancer. And I think that's what motivates oncologists to do the work that they do, and probably pharmaceutical executives to do the work they do to some extent. So I think that's good, and that should be that way. And there's not the same kinds of incentives that are more systems level incentives for prevention, I think, which you're getting at. There's both not in something like asthma, where you have a very immediate result of, say, an environmental exposure. So if you address a mold issue in a child's house, that child's going to go to the emergency room fewer times, go to the hospital fewer times. And so the insurer is going to, be happy about that and perhaps be willing to pay for that mold remediation because it's going to save them money, in the hospitalization. And that connection is not quite as clear with something like cancer because the exposures are a long time ago, and then it takes the cancer a long time to develop.
Right.
But, it should be able to be an argument that preventing cancers, would be cost saving for those that are paying for it. But it's a little hard to demonstrate that, and the sort of short-term profit orientation means that doesn't motivate quite in the same way. Yeah. And then I think this colleague of mine, Margaret Kripke, is an amazing woman who's been very involved in cancer leadership. She's an immunologist and a cancer specialist who was at MD Anderson Cancer Center. And she served on the President's Cancer Panel, which is a body of appointed people that take up a particular issue on cancer every year. And in 2010, they were convinced to take up the issue of environmental contributors to cancer. And she was very reluctant to take that issue on because it was very controversial and she wasn't sure it was very important. And but through the course of learning about it, doing all this work, she's become a real champion on it. But anyway, one of the things she says is that cancer prevention doesn't have a face.
Yeah.
So
they haven't got cancer yet.
Right. Yeah. And we're very motivated, as we should be, by people who have faces, or real people who are, going through this. That's a
really good way to put it. Yeah, I was searching for those words about like it's less immediate. It doesn't just strike that visceral desire to help in the same way because it's thinking globally, thinking broadly.
Yeah.
And thinking the future, which is hard.
Yeah. And the other aspect of the cancer-free economy is that, part of this system that is continuing to generate cancer is the production of toxic chemicals and the use of toxic chemicals. And so the idea of how we could shift the economy so that it relies on materials, technologies, chemicals that are not cancer causing or causing of other chronic diseases, but, that are safer, so that you could have that thriving economy that wouldn't be also contributing to cancer. That's sort of the other half of that.
One question that comes up for me is, there's a lot of research involved in determining which chemicals are the biggest issue causing cancer or any other kinds of illness. And I think that I don't have a specific historical example, but there have been cases where one chemical was determined, was outlawed for a certain use. And then the chemical that replaced it, as time went on and there was enough research, turned out to be also harmful.
Yeah.
Right? Because we have the body of research once something's actually in use in industry and on the market. So yeah, I've been wondering about that as I've been following your work, and I wonder how you think about that.
Yeah. It's true. It does happen. And a couple of things about that. One is that we have a different regulatory approach in this country, where it's just what you're saying. There's not extensive testing required prior to marketing. And so we do often not find out about this until it's been in use.
Yeah.
Europe has a different approach where there's much more testing required up front. And so there's an opportunity to prevent something before it gets out there, but also much more of an incentive on the part of a company to figure out through its own testing, whether something's going to be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
But one really hopeful arena is this area called green chemistry, where chemists are actually trained to design molecules that are not toxic. And it's quite a concept, and it's kind of remarkable that people trained in chemistry, from elementary school and high school on through graduate work, have not been taught toxicology. And it's only really in the last 15 years that people have thought, well, actually, that's a really relevant discipline for a chemist to have. And there's a great organization called Beyond Benign, and it's doing curriculum at all levels of education that is integrating this knowledge about toxics and some of the problematic impacts that chemicals traditionally designed have had, so that a whole new crop of chemists can, be graduating and working, who are just thinking about their jobs in very different ways.
Wow.
So it's small, but it's one of those elements of what's going on out there that, if you get a big charge, a big amount of energy behind that in the form of funding and, scaling these, it's a really exciting direction and opportunity. And that would prevent just the thing you're talking about, the next slightly different chemical that turns out to have, just as significant problems.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. I haven't heard of this before. And it's almost like preventing the need for cancer prevention. It's like a step even before.
Yeah.
Phenomenal.
Yeah.
So I think the way you talk, no matter what you're addressing, really reflects this idea of systems thinking, which I've heard you speak about. But I'm not sure if every one of our listeners knows what systems thinking is. So could you talk a little bit about that and how it plays into your work with the Cancer-Free Economy Network and why it's important?
Yeah, sure. So systems thinking is about understanding kind of the dynamics of all sorts of relationships that result in something being the way it is, and being willing to kind of take a step back and look at a 30,000-foot view to say, oh, I see. Well, that institution is operating in this way, and that impacts this other institution. And then this sector is motivated by that, and that results in this. So it's kind of a way of thinking and a way of asking questions that has some really specific kind of practices to it. So when we got this Cancer-Free Economy Network started, we spent a whole year working with consultants to map this system. And the first question is, well, how big is the system? Where are you going to draw the line? So the system we decided to map was the system of the production and use of toxic chemicals, but also the health system that, needs to take care of people when they get sick because of toxic chemicals and many other things. And so we decided to bound the system in that way, and then to map it. And the way we mapped it was we brought together people from all across that system, and we sat together for over a number of days, and there were a lot of Post-it notes exchanged. We basically began to draw the system and the dynamics among the organizations in the system, and to locate, where the different organizations around the table were in that system. And so we came to, an understanding of some of these dynamics. And then we said, well, if we were to, as broad a diverse group of organizations as we are, if we could kind of put some pressure in a few different places in the system, where would that be? That if we were to do it collaboratively, we actually would have the potential to really shift the dynamics of that system. And so that's what led to the establishment of the Cancer-Free Economy Network, was this process of doing the systems map together, but then building the relationships among one another that we could collaborate over the longer term in doing projects together that were designed to catalyze that kind of change.
Amazing. We're trying to do similar work we're not focused on prevention, but just on community building and story sharing, stories that are often outside of the mainstream medical narrative. And behind the scenes, we're really focused on how we can build a coalition around these alternative narratives and bring people together, because for the past certainly 2 decades, there are a lot of people who've been telling similar stories. But I think maybe policy and certainly activism, there's more of an awareness of how powerful it is when multiple organizations and leaders come together. And in the space of media or even like patient support organizations, there isn't always that awareness of what can happen when you join forces.
Yeah.
So I'm really inspired to hear that beginning.
Yeah. Well, and you're raising the issue of narrative too is so important. And that is one thing that surfaced in this systems analysis. I'll give you one example, this idea of feedback loops, where one thing leads to another, and that feedback loop perpetuates the system, in the way that it is. That's just the status quo. It's going to keep looping, unless you do something to disrupt it. And so one of them that we looked at was basically starts with the idea that chemicals are not extensively regulated really in this country, and that there's not much, as we were talking about earlier, not much data that are required, to have a chemical go out on the market. So that's one start of the feedback loop. And then if you continue to move around that, well, then industry is able to say, oh, there's not much data, and so don't regulate us. We'll just carry on. There's no proof. And then you've got, members of Congress and others who are bringing scientists in to say, well, is there more data that we're not aware of? Tell us about that. And they are trained to be skeptical, scientists, and having been through that training myself, you're always reluctant to come to too big a conclusion. You tend to just be trained in being skeptical and in saying, well, we know some things, but there's really no proof. And it's just a way of being for scientists, and to some extent for clinicians and other people that are, very instrumental in how the public thinks about these issues.
And then the public too. I mean, we're going to doctors for medical advice and understanding our own health by just, I don't know, Kaiser Permanente literature or anything like that. There's a similar skepticism especially about causes of certain of illness.
Yeah, absolutely. And then if we all have that, the scientists, the clinicians, and the public have that, then there is not really a sense of there's something we can do about this. It's more, we sort of adopt the sense of, well, cancer is just bad luck, or it's inevitable, or that's just the world that we live in, and kind of throw our hands up in despair. And that means that there's not a lot of advocacy by the public to members of Congress and others around these issues being important, which then, continues to lead to not very extensive regulation. So that's the feedback loop sort of. But the narrative piece of that you raised, I think is so important, because the place that we identified we could, intervene in that feedback loop because of who was around our table was the scientists and the clinicians and the general public, and to help them see where the narratives that they were, adopting might actually be preventing some action that they would really like to see happen, but they hadn't realized that their language, the way they were communicating these issues, was likely to have that kind of an impact. And so working with them to be able to talk about their science in ways that are accurate and also motivating to people. So there may not be complete proof, but we don't need complete proof, because there's this opportunity to do something about it. So we should go ahead and do it. Just slight changes, but ones that could really catalyze a different kind of output.
Yeah, you wrote that a lot of the common cancer narratives we hold are disempowering and serve to shift the focus away from prevention. You just said a few of them, but I also loved your example. There's nothing we can do except focus on supporting our loved ones. And if we want to have jobs, we need to accept some risks to our health, which, I mean, they just ring so true. I've heard those narratives everywhere. And even if not explicitly, it does feel like those are the stories we're told. So it's amazing that you took us here, because I wanted to end with a little role play, just wondering what you say, what you have said. If somebody says to you, we want jobs, we need to accept some wrist or help?
Yeah, I think what I would say is that there's a need for us all to envision a future where we could have good, well-paying jobs that don't make us sick. And that's not possible overnight, but it's a vision that we can hold and move towards. And there's lots of wonderful examples of sectors that have really taken this on. And I'll just tell a story going back to the perchloroethylene and the dry cleaning that we were involved in a local neighborhood where it was a immigrant family from Venezuela, and they were getting ready to retire, and they wanted to have their son take over the business. And he said, I don't feel good when I'm in this dry cleaner. I've got a headache, and I don't want my kids sort of playing around on the floor after school. I really don't want to take this business over. And this had been, a lifelong business for his parents, and, that was hard on them. And then they learned about this program in Massachusetts that, and I mentioned in the very beginning, that helps businesses figure out how to reduce their use of toxics. And it turns out that there's a way to do dry cleaning called professional wet cleaning that doesn't use any toxic chemicals. And there was a grant program that this institute set up that was available for small dry cleaners like theirs to purchase this professional wet cleaning equipment. And so we introduced them to this, and they were awarded, a grant to make this transition. And then they needed some technical support. So they were connected to other dry cleaners that had made the transition, and there became this peer-to-peer thing that was going on. And then there was a campaign in the neighborhood that people who had their dry cleaning at other shops committed to moving their dry cleaning to this new shop because of what they were doing environmentally. And they agreed to it, sort of like a community supported agriculture model, where they agreed to commit, a certain amount of money up front, and then they would have credit for their dry cleaning at the store. So that enabled them to, have a bit more money to make this transition. And so they did make the transition, and all those things came together. And there was a ribbon cutting that opened the new store, and their son, Ernesto, was at the opening, and he made the announcement at that moment that he had decided he was going to take over the business from his parents because it had gone, made that shift. So there's a lot of, great examples about those kinds of changes that have occurred that, have really made jobs healthier and allowed a business to not only continue to make ends meet, but sometimes, thrive to an even greater extent, because it becomes a real, a brand for them to say, we're doing this in ways that are good for our workers and good for our customers.
Amazing. Well, we hardly touched on your own experience of cancer, but there's just so much to talk about. Is there anything still sitting with you that you want to share?
Yeah. I think on that one, that was an aggressive skin cancer that I had that resulted in radiation. And that one is because as a kid, I didn't wear sunscreen. There's sort of no question about that. And I remember, being a kid just getting burned, and I'm like a marshmallow, just burn and pull the skin off and go at it again. And so obviously I, slather my daughters with sunscreen when they were kids, because we know something different about it. But now we also understand that we need to have sunscreens that don't impact coral reefs in the way that traditional sunscreens do. There's amazing how much impact there is from swimmers using toxic sunscreens that are designed to protect us, but which actually are bad for the environment. So there needs to be a shift now in there. So there's just a little bit of there are two things out of that. One is, I wear sunscreen, I wear sun shirts. There absolutely are things that individuals can do to prevent their own cancers. And that there's also, sort of out of my husband's experience, but also everything that I've learned and the work that I've done, that say that we need to have, systems level changes that are decisions that individuals can't make, but individuals can influence those decisions. Individuals can, influence their decision makers in government. They can band together as consumers to, request that Home Depot stop supplying paints with methylene chloride, which is a consumer-driven campaign that had a big impact on what's on the shelves in Home Depot. So yeah, I think it just all comes back for me to it's both and. We do need to pay attention to how we live our lives and be engaged and active in sort of broader community level decisions.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please leave a review in your podcast app. To check out our upcoming community workshops, visit CancerTalks.com/Zoom. If you're moved to donate, we would be very grateful. Our work is funded by your generous contributions. For more information, visit CancerTalks.com/donate.